Hi, Alex. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Tony. Thanks for having me here.
No, anytime. Uh, for everybody that's watching the podcast, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Alex Scott. I'm an associate professor at the University of Tennessee. I've been in transportation logistics and supply chain management for a little bit over 20 years. That involves engineering projects to consulting projects for 5 or 6 years of strategic supply chain consulting. In the last dozen years or so, I've been in academia and researching primarily on the transportation and trucking industry, safety aspects, and have recently gotten into sustainability the last 5 years or so.
Great. Could you mention some top results that you've achieved during your career?
Yeah, so I've won some research awards, several different a number of different academic publications and good journals, which is kind of the goal of us as academics. More recently, been working on trying to improve sustainability data that's available to companies, and launched a company in the last year that is providing basically data services to allow hundreds of companies to get better insights into the sustainability profiles of their logistics providers. So that's kind of been a fun thing recently.
Great. So, you've done a lot of research. What's some crucial insights that you found from the research?
Yeah. So one project that's completed about a little bit over a year ago was looking at a voluntary sustainability program here in the United States. They call it the Smart Way program. It's by the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So we delved into the data in the Smart Way program, which was a really interesting and I think a useful, helpful program, which I think has had positive benefits to it. But one of the things when we went into that program was we looked at how many of the companies, since it's voluntary, right? So that means companies can join or they cannot join. And so the number of companies that joined was a very small percentage of the industry we're studying. So it's the trucking industry in the US, which is one of the largest sources of emissions in the United States and in the world. And and so a very small percentage of companies participate in that program. So really the problem with the program is getting companies to participate. And that's something that's quite overlooked. And so that was really striking to us as we were delving into that data.
Hmm. So it was staggering that companies didn't want to participate.
Yeah. So anytime you set, yeah, the insight was, or one of the insights was, anytime you set up a program that's voluntary participation, and you say it's free, so it's technically quote unquote free for companies to join. But what was required is these companies have to provide a bunch of different data, right? A bunch of different types of data. Some of it useful, in my opinion. Much of it not useful though. And so if you do that, that is a cost because that data has to be collected, and participating in the program requires filling out paperwork and all these kinds of things. And so if you have a bunch of small companies, those companies aren't going to have the people or the resources to participate. And so if we looked at who was in this, the large companies were in this program, but there were practically no small companies, and there are hundreds of thousands of small companies out there. And so if you are trying to get this voluntary program called, again, the Smart Way program, they're trying to get that. Well, if you use those few thousand carriers in that program, that's fine. But if you use any of the other hundreds of thousands of carriers not in it, you're not going to have any data for them. And the weakness there, so the thought is that if you're designing these kinds of programs, you need to make them as simple and easily to participate as possible, because that is a cost. Participating in it is a cost
Mm.
that needs to be considered.
And I can just imagine when you're like a owner operator, a trucker, uh, that you don't have time even to sell. You only have time to take care your daily activities in your business. So everything extra is just terrible, probably.
Exactly. I mean, they don't even. So that's why they go through brokers, right? The owner operators that you're talking about, they use brokers for the most part, and that is basically their selling agent. And yes, exactly.
Mm. And like the large companies buying from the brokers, don't the large companies, don't they require them to participate or to get a certain information?
So historically, no, but that is what is going to be changing with some of these rules and regulations, right? So the EU has rules requiring certainly large companies to report some level of Scope 3 emissions. The state of California has has some rules requiring companies to report Scope 3 emissions. The SEC, Security Exchange Commission, here in the U.S., is requiring companies to report Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, not necessarily Scope 3 emissions. But that, that's for now. We'll see what it looks like in the future. But regardless, companies are having to report their Scope 3 emissions. Transportation emissions that you outsource, be it trucking, be it ocean, be it rail, whatever, is a Scope 3 emission. And so if companies are having to report that, then they are going to need that information. And so, yes. And so actually we're working with a number of brokers. The company I started is working with a number of brokers, because that is now a way that you can score the small carriers, that the brokers can then provide that information to the shippers who are their customers.
Mm, yeah, and there's probably the owners don't want to even give away all the information to the brokers.
Yeah. Well, so how do you get that data? It's a great question. So if you think about a single truck on the road, how do you get information on him? That's really a difficult problem, especially if he doesn't want to give you that information. And as you say, in a lot of cases, that's going to be true. They're not going to want to say, "Yeah, here's my operational details, exactly of my business." Most aren't going to want to do that. So in the absence of getting actual fuel consumption, which actually, if we think 5 to 10 years out, where do I think we'll be? I think in 10 years, you'll get actual fuel consumption, right? You move a load from one point to another. I do think you'll actually get that information, but you don't get that now. And so we have to use ways of estimating those emissions, or models, or we call those models of those emissions. And so one thing, having had dozens of conversations with dozens of different companies, some people are comfortable with the idea of estimating and modeling, but a lot of people aren't comfortable. And the point about modeling is like, well, you're not actually measuring your X number of gallons. We're estimating it, right? And so then the question people always fall into is, well, how accurate does it need to be? And what kind of piece of data do we use to estimate that? And I think that's very much a dynamic and fluid
So
situation.
do you go into such details that you look at different kind of like fuels? Like you could look at two different fuel companies that provide fuel from the stations, and you look at their products that another one has lower emissions on their diesel and another one has lower, or do you go by generic standards? What are the values?
Yeah. So so if we're talking about what the solution we are providing, the data we are providing, is we provide insights into the types of equipment that different carriers and truckers use, and those emit at different rates, right? Most of them in the U.S. are diesel, but we do capture whether they're natural gas or electric, right? Because those are going to have different, what we call emissions factors, right? And emissions factor is the rate at which it emits, say, CO2 or some other pollutant. Um, and so the main policy shift over the last 15 years here in the US, I think it's true in the EU too, is cleaner trucks, right? Manufacturers, the Volvos of the world, the Daimlers and the Freightliners and the PACCAR, the major manufacturers have been making cleaner trucks. And that's by federal mandate. Some of it voluntary by themselves, but federal mandate, they've been required by the US to make cleaner trucks. And so if you have these cleaner trucks, what you want to do is you want to get insight into the types of trucks that these companies are using. Because if I'm using a 2010 truck versus a 2020 truck, there's a huge difference in the amount of emissions they're putting out. And so that gets to like actionable data, right? We want actionable data. If you just use averages of averages, that doesn't do you any good. But if you get actionable data where you can actually choose that person with a 2020 truck as opposed to the 2010 truck, you can reduce your emissions.
So what about the counting model? So if I buy from a broker, and the broker buys from the owner operators, and let's say I'm having like 500 trucks that I need that I'm buying from daily. How should a company like focus on counting those emissions? Should they just, look at the statistics and that one person just counts them by themselves without even talking to the brokers? or what's like the optimal solution to measure emissions if money is not an issue?
Yeah. Well, okay. So there's yeah, that's a good question. So you're talking about, so you have a shipper, they have 500 loads for a variety of carriers and brokers they're using. How do they account for those emissions? Is that kind of what you're asking?
Yeah. So I'm asking, how does the one that buys the shipments,
Yep.
uh, sh- can he count everything by himself, or does he need to be in contact with the broker?
Yeah. Well, so the person, so let's say the shipper, the person who is paying for the shipment, whose goods are going from one point to another, um, they, if they're using a broker, they usually will have information, or well, they will not always know which carrier underlying is using it, right? They'll just know they contracted with a broker and they have a rate with that broker. The broker then uses a carrier underlying to ship that. The shipper, the person paying for it, as you're saying, will then generally need to get that information from the broker, because they're not going to get it directly from the carrier, because the broker is the one directly interacting with the carrier. So in that case, the broker needs to get the data from the carrier, and they would provide that information to the shipper. Now that so then the question is, how does the broker get that data? And there are thousands of brokers out there. So that's one of the goals of our data company is, well, we have this information on 400,000 carriers. So you got all these brokers can just use that same data source to provide data to their shippers. So it simplifies things greatly, as opposed to all of these companies doing all of these different things, which makes no sense.
I could probably name drop it. Was sustainlog.com.
Yes, www.sustainlog.com. Absolutely. Thank you. Yep.
Yeah, no worries. I've never even thought of that like such a model. We don't have that in in Europe, because that would be spectacular. We only know how much uh, trucks have been sold that are like electric or natural gas and so on, but not
Yeah.
who owns them.
Yeah. And traditionally, what a lot of companies have done is use basically just industry average. And this is what, going back to your original question of what kind of insights from research, I was just trying to get a grasp of how do they do it now? What's the current state now? And so there were a lot of companies who would just use industry averages. But if you just use one number, there's nothing actionable about one number, right? There's no decision you can make if you just have one number, because you can't change providers, you can't change equipment, you can't. You're just using one number. So yeah.
How do you see like there are penalties for not doing the emission counting and lowering your emissions? How do you see that regulators are following up on those? Like, are companies being inspected?
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple things. So there's the public aspect of it, and then there's the private aspect of it. So I'll talk about both of those. So the public aspect is very much emerging in the sense that all of these laws and rules have been recently coming out, and usually they are to be implemented, say, by the year 2027 or 2030 or something like that. Usually they have. So we have not gotten to the point yet where the regulators are coming in, auditing, and assessing penalties. We probably will get to that point, but we have not gotten to that point yet. I know, like the California law. So if you look at Scope 3 emissions for California, I think even up to 2030, they say as long as you're trying your best, I think they use the word good faith. They use good faith and reasonable. As long as you're doing that, we're not going to bother you about it. Is basically what they say. So we're not to the point yet where the regulators do that. But what companies have been overlooking, because what we have seen are law. So talking about the private aspect of it, we have been seeing lawsuits emerge. Actually, some European companies have been sued, I think here in the U.S. But what the claim is of greenwashing or misleading consumers. So if you have a pledge where you say, I'm going to be carbon neutral or net zero, right? But you don't in any way follow up on that, and then all of a sudden you get some creative attorney who says, well, I found some people who said they bought your goods because you said this and you're not, right? And then they sue them over it. I mean, there are exact examples of that are publicly available. I'd be happy to share them. But that is the private element of enforcing these, right? So it's not, don't just view it as cheap talk, right? Don't just view it as, I can say whatever I want and not face any problems with it.
Are customers like willing to buy from companies that use sustainable fuel and do real actions?
I do think there are. I think, well, you get a mix. You get some who are and some who aren't. If you talk to some people, they'll say, we really haven't found people willing to take a big loss on investing hugely in sustainability. Clearly, some are. I mean, people are using renewable natural gas. People are using renewable diesel. The cheaper way to do it would just be regular diesel. But so companies are investing in this. Electric trucks. Currently now, certainly Class 8 electric trucks are way more expensive than just regular diesel trucks. And so some companies are adopting that. So they're putting their money where their mouth is. So there are certainly companies doing that. Is it every company? No, it's not every company. I do find most companies are willing to spend a small amount to see something. It's when you start to talk into the huge dollars that companies start to balk, which is very understandable. But yeah, it's a mix.
Mm. I listened to a previous podcast that you talked about a point system that had like service, a price, safety, and sustainability. So if I'd like to get such a framework, adopt such a framework for my company, how should I use it and point it? Like do the points.
Yeah, absolutely. So companies, and that's referring to procurement events where companies are choosing which supplier to go to. And again, that's universal. It's trucking, but it's rail, it's ocean, it's air, it's everything, right? And so it's typically when companies do this, they of course look at price and service. Those are the two big things: price and service. Are you the cheapest and you provide good service? A third one that's often looked at is safety, and companies should look at safety records because these are public companies. These are transportation companies with history. So safety is usually is important because again, there's also the threat of lawsuit there too, which I'm well aware of. And then the fourth one. So those are three things that have historically been captured. The fourth now is sustainability, because typically companies have not asked for this kind of information, but now more and more they are asking for this information in procurement. And I want to go from the more sustainable supplier than the less, especially if they're going to start being scored on their scope 3 emissions. They're certainly going to want to start asking about that. And so those are the four things they need to consider. Now, that your question of how do you balance price versus sustainability? Well, that's getting back to your original your question just previously. How much are you willing to pay for? Are you willing to pay for someone who has cleaner trucks? I do think there's a certain amount people are willing to pay, but there's also a certain amount they're not willing to pay. So there's, where does that fall? That's going to be different for every company.
Mm-hmm. So if you'd be a buyer, what would be the bare minimum that a company should have that they pass?
Yeah. So the big so a lot of there's a range of different pollution profiles of equipment on the road, and I'm just going to talk about trucks in the U.S., but the same thing would be true in Europe. And so all that capacity is needed in the current state, but what we want to do is get rid of the really old dirty stuff, and there are really old dirty trucks out there. And if you look at emissions profiles of those that's the big problem right now. So if you could get rid of the bottom 10-20%, you'd really make the emissions go a lot lower. And so if I were a shipper, I wouldn't say I need everybody to have a brand new truck. I don't think that's realistic. You're not going to be able to get that. But I think saying, well, we're not going to accept anybody that has a score of X% or worse, right? And that number would be up to the shipper. But I think getting the dirty stuff off the road, say the 10, 20, 30%, get them off the road. That's the most important one.
Mm.
And so you could do that. So how would you do that? So if you're using, say, a broker who sources from all these carriers, you could tell the broker, well, I don't want you, if you're shipping my load, I don't want you using a carrier that scores below some number.
But how do you proof it that he's not really using it?
Well, so you would have a contract with the broker, and so you'd write that in the contract, right? And so then if the broker were to breach that contract, then of course then you have other the broker generally would not want to breach that kind of contract because you get
It's
trouble
fatal.
and stuff. Yeah.
So,
But of course, unless you verify,
yeah. So what's one, like, if a trucker is listening to this, like, what's the bare minimum that he or she would need to do now?
Yeah, well, so I think looking at ways so if you're driving a really old truck and you see them out there, I think thinking about when you're going to upgrade that truck would be important. So I had a guy, so for instance, when I moved to Tennessee, I had a guy driving a 1999 truck. I know it probably blows your mind. It's crazy. And it broke down literally the week before and delayed my goods for at least a week. So it's totally annoying. But that truck emits so high, and so that should be upgraded, right? So, save your money and get financing for how you can get a newer and cleaner truck, because there's no need for a 2010 truck or older. There's no need for those trucks anymore out on the road when you can get one that's a lot cleaner.
Mm. So have you studied anything about, like, we've talked about, like, the environment aspect, but have you studied like social impact also? Like, how are companies paying their drivers? Are companies being ethical?
So I've not gotten into that aspect as much. Methods of pay, like hourly versus activity based or distance based. I've certainly read research on that, but I've not been huge into that side of things. No.
Okay. Uh, what's something controversial that you believe in that's going to happen, but others don't yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, well, one, I do think so. People who push back against the sustainability and the reporting and the data, I do think it's inevitable that it's going to happen. And so I think even though some people say, well, what's the value of this? I'm not saying everybody says. Some people say, what's the value of this? I do think it's going to happen. But there is a controversial mandate, actually, that involves the rail industry here in the U.S. and electrifying the rail industry. So this is actually a really interesting kind of conundrum. So I'll just give you a quick background. There's been a push by the state of California to electrify trains, right? So trains in the U.S., right all throughout the U.S., nationwide, transcontinental, a huge number of containers come in through California and go into the U.S., right? And many of those hit the rail. And so California's been pushing to electrify the trains, but we do not have those electrified, battery-driven trains here in the United States, really, and not for freight, not for heavy-duty freight, anyways. And so if you do that, so you could make rail cleaner, right? Which I think everybody, in absence of any other change, if you could make rail cleaner, trains cleaner, that's good, right? I think we would all agree on that. However, if you, by making rail to be cleaner, if they get costlier, and if their service gets in any way worse, guess what happens to those loads that go on the train? The shippers say, well, it's more expensive now, and I don't get as reliable service. I'm going to ship it via truck, right? And I worked for one of the largest intermodal, what is called intermodal transportation in the U.S. For a few years. And I know this exactly would happen. If rail got more expensive or the service got worse, all of a sudden these guys would just say, well, I'm just going to ship it via truck. And guess what? Truck has a emissions rate about 10 times higher than rail. And so what we want is you want everything on rail as much as possible, because rail has the best emissions profile of anything on land. Ocean is the best in absolute terms, but you can't ship an ocean liner, from California to Chicago. So anyways, even if you made rail cleaner, if you make it in any way worse, that stuff shifts to truck, which all of a sudden makes emissions a lot worse. And so actually I wrote a comment to the EPA because they're considering whether to approve California's rule or not. And I hope they don't. And I pointed out that this is going to make emissions worse. So that it's the tricky part. And that's what's funny about it. You could make emissions for rail better, but actually make overall emissions worse if it has any other impact on rail. And it certainly is going to have that impact. So,
And I think that like land, rail, air, ocean, they all have like a different roadmap on lowering emissions that don't talk to each other.
yeah, exactly. And so yeah, exactly about air. So another mode is air versus ocean, right? Because those two compete with one another. And the Environmental Defense Fund, which is the EDF, a big, well-known environmental, they have a thing called the Green Freight Handbook. So for your listeners out there, if you want something really good to read, I have all my students in my classes read. It's called the Green Freight Handbook by the EDF. It's free online. And they have all kinds of great recommendations for how to reduce your carbon footprint. And guess what? One of their major points is choose the best mode. And what are the best modes? The best modes are ocean and rail if you're talking about purely emissions, right? Of course we need trucks. Of course we need air. But if you're purely talking about emissions, ocean and rail is the way to go.
Yeah. So you don't have any like they're all private operators for rail in California. They're not like state owned.
Yeah, I mean, there are no so freight state-owned operations. No, and I know that's different in Europe. You have a lot of national rail services, right? I don't know about freight, but I know for your passenger
Yeah.
services you do. But no, it's privatized here in the U.S. as we would want. Yeah, because you don't want states. So that's kind of one of the main points of interstate commerce is you can't have states having their own regulations because that's just going to make things really complicated. We want a standard across the whole nation.
Do you have a standard like through all the states? Like, do you have different regulations in Mississippi, different regulations in Hawaii?
No, you're for the most part for interstate commerce, you're not allowed to do that. That's illegal. That's been the Interstate Commerce Act and various different laws through the years. States are not allowed to do that now. So California, because their air pollution in the 60s and 70s was so bad, they got a carve out, like a special set aside where they had this, where they actually can do some of their own local regulations. But generally, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has control or authority over the entire country. And we wouldn't want individual states having it. But that's for the environment. It is actually there. California does have, and that's where this conflict is coming up. But EPA ultimately has the right to override that.
What about like freight sizes? Can you have different freight sizes in different states?
So freight size, if you're talking about like size of loads and the weights,
Yeah.
that's no, that's standard. So that's standard across the United States. It's regulated by what's called a gross vehicle weight rating. So gross vehicle weight can be 80,000 pounds. So no, I'm talking imperial units, not metric units. Whatever 80,000 pounds translates into divided by 2.2, and you get your kilograms. But 80,000 pounds that's nationwide. Yeah. So states cannot have their own rules on that.
Okay. So, do you have any opinions related to carbon credits or alternative fuels?
Yeah, well, I think alternative fuels are great. I mean, from everything I've heard, renewable diesel, renewable natural gas are both very good, promising, kind of circular almost ways of getting fuel. So I think those are great. I think companies that use that should be able to count that against their emissions to have lower emissions, right? Because they have lower emissions factors. And so if you're using that, you should use that factor to reduce, so you have a lower count. Carbon credits, if implemented properly, can be good. I mean, you hear the stories of like, oh, a forest that already exists, and so you buy the forest that already exists and you claim that's a carbon credit. I mean, that's not really doing anything, right? But if it's properly designed and encouraging people to actually maybe plant this new forest, then I can see that being valuable.
Mhm. Okay. Are there any any key nudges for truckers, brokers, uh, shippers, like key nudges that drive them towards sustainability other than the penalties and our general goal? Like, do you get tax reductions? Do you get like benefits if you do you get like a benefit of a certain amount of dollars if you buy a specific truck? What has really worked?
So there may be some credits for, and there have been grants given for investing in natural gas and in electric trucks. There certainly are government credits for things like that, and often kind of sometimes they're local, sometimes they're state, sometimes they're national. So typically are grants. There are also programs called clean port programs. So around ports, you have trucks that service the ports. These are called drayage trucks. So often there's funding for companies that service those ports to get, say, $20,000 or $30,000 if they upgrade to a newer truck, and the driver or the company has to apply and go through this program, but they can get financial incentives to buy a cleaner truck to service the port. So there are certainly those incentives. I think ultimately a market-based solution is best, where, and that's really what, not to go back to what my company's trying to do, but what we're trying to do is if you can give insight to a shipper, right? So right now the shipper does not have insight into that carrier. If they can get that insight and they're willing to pay for a cleaner one, then that provides a direct incentive for the carrier to have cleaner equipment, right? And so that's a market-based solution, where then if the carrier gets paid a little bit more for cleaner trucks, well, then they're going to be more likely to buy new cleaner trucks. And so that's going to quicken the rate at which we are buying these cleaner trucks. And that's without a government requirement or a government solution. And it's a market-based solution, which I think would be really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of good questions. Is there anything that I haven't asked from you that you'd like me to ask?
Well, you've asked a lot of really good questions. I think, so I have conversations with companies, every week about this. I just had one the other day with a major shipping company, and it's the Wild West out there in terms of data, right? There is just not really great standardized data, because then we're talking about the U.S., or I'm talking about the U.S. here, but then you got Europe and then you got Asia. Those are all different ball games, right? And you got different modes. And so we're far along and far away from standardization. But I do think we need to make steps towards standardization and make it easier on people, so we don't have 1,000 different people doing 1,000 different things.
Yeah, I totally agree on that.
Yeah, great.
Thanks so much, Alex, for having this time.
Yes, thanks for having me, Tony. Good to join you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.